much, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here today. And yes, you may know me from movies like I Can't Believe He's the Lord Mayor, but certainly I'm really keen to take off those chains, put them aside, and talk about how cities are going to change and evolve using a different mechanism, and that is of temporary activation of cities. So there's my other identity in Twitter, and I actively encourage you to join me in the conversation while I'm up here on stage or afterwards. So I believe in the transformation of cities. In fact, cities are always transforming every day, every week, every month, every year. In fact, realistically, no one in this room could tell me of too many cities that don't look, taste, smell, feel, touch different to what they were like 10 years ago, let alone 20 or 30 years ago. But to a certain extent, we've lost that sense of understanding that cities do change, how they change, and the processes of change. I also believe that the urban planning profession, I can criticise them because I'm an urban planner, maybe have a go at the architects and other design communities. They think of cities in three dimensions. So roads, parks, buildings, built form, scale, structure, those sorts of things. But cities are effectively a four-dimensional construct. And the missing dimension that we often don't take into consideration when we think about planning and changing our cities is time. So time is a process of change, and this is a natural tension between the future versus now. We're very good at talking about the future. Adelaide in particular is nationally recognised as fantastic at planning the future. We make strategic plans, we have long-term visions, and we are always talking about tomorrow. But there is a genuine tension between the future and now. And in the process of focusing on the future, I think sometimes we forget to think about now. We forget to understand how now plays an active role in creating the future that we want to see. And this is where temporary spaces come in. So I'm going to show some slides about what temporary spaces are, but it can be anything from activating this beautiful old building here with Tuxedo Cat, right through to food, arts, culture, and a whole range of other things. But in principle, it's about capturing spaces, using them in the now to try and actually get change happening in your city. And it ultimately, very simply, is all about trying to create great places in a great city. So some examples. Well, shipping containers are big right now, I can tell you. This is from Times Square, New York, a square of international regard that still thinks it's good enough and okay and appropriate to have a shipping container that's been turned into a cafe. I recently came back from Christchurch, and boy, do they know how to use shipping containers. So this is an entire shopping centre, the Restart Mall, right in the middle of Christchurch, where they've put together a huge number of shipping containers to actually create an entire shopping precinct. Now we put one in for the City of Adelaide with our bicycle parking. We've got about 20 people a day using it for showers, for parking, etc. But also, while we're on Christchurch, this is another great temporary activation. This is a dancer mat. So that is actually a nightclub that has been temporarily put up. You can see the mirror ball, you can see the speakers, and for $2 you can have a dance. This is an example from Denmark about seating and how seating can chop and change, and this notion that you can use temporary building infrastructure, temporary building materials to chop and change. And it also reinforces for me the ephemeral nature of temporary activation, which is that this is the middle of summer, and I can guarantee you no one would want to sit there in the middle of a Danish winter. San Francisco, they really did start the parklet movement, the parking day experiment that Adelaide has taken on really well. Of all 160 cities that did parking day 2 years ago, Adelaide had the third highest number of temporary parking spaces on that day, behind San Francisco and a little place called Paris. So, I really want to stress by saying that Adelaide is really in this space, that we are really interested in adopting some of these things, and that's a great example from San Francisco there. Also Vancouver, community gardens. Expect to see more pop-up patches coming out in your city today and tomorrow, and so there's this really strong push to try and green, and you can do this on a temporary nature. It might be there 1 month or 1 year or 5 years, and then afterwards it may be developed and you move on to another space. That's a great example there. And of course the food cart phenomenon. It's really growing all over the world. Burger Theory is a classic example of using social media to actually show people where you are and to activate a range of spaces in a way that was yet to be imagined just 10 years ago. Another example of transport infrastructure. This is Vancouver again, where literally overnight those planter boxes were put in to create a bicycle network in the city. Fantastic result, but if it doesn't work, it can be as easily taken out in 24 hours as well. And of course, the all-eternal street art. Love my street art, I know lots of people do, and this is about the ephemeral nature of cities. It's about the statements that people make about the communities they live in. It's not only the people that do it, it's the people who stop and appreciate it. It's what brings character, what brings life, it's what defines spaces and is constantly changing, and so street art is a very important part of that. Adelaide City Council really decided last year that we were going to make a splash, that we were going to stick our toe in the water and give temporary activation a red hot go. So some examples are the big crowds that we got on some of the streets for street parties. We got the small businesses involved, we got the tables and chairs out, we got the food out on the street, and we had big parties. The opposite is actually just going down to the hardware store, buying some chairs, chucking them out all over the city, and getting people to stop, to calm down, to engage in place, and just absorb the ambience of the area. And that was also a hugely successful project. But we also engaged with community groups and got people doing markets and of course outdoor cinema. There are so many things that you can do. I must stress, these are all public realm. 80% of our public realm in cities all over the world are actually the streets of that city, as well as of course the open space and the parklands, etc. But we can also do things inside our buildings, and I've mentioned Tuxedo Cat here, and Renew Adelaide's been doing a great job. That's the sort of opportunities we do have to create new spaces in the city. What I like about this project is it is affordable. The truth is, state government, federal government, local government, in fact cities all over the world are cash strapped right now. We can actually activate a street for 10 grand. We can put a mural on a wall for about $5,000. We can support the next generation of leaders with $100,000 to start Renew Adelaide and go out and have a conversation about how we can use old buildings. It's a very affordable way of getting outcomes for your city. It's an absolute bargain, and when you're a small council and you really only have a couple of $100,000 to actually even spend on any infrastructure, the idea of activating your city or your main towns or parks in your area for $5,000, $10,000 is a very, very appealing opportunity. It's also outcome orientated. It's a great opportunity for people to say, this is what we want on the streets of our city. Instead of looking at process, instead of having a philosophical discussion, it's actually about stuff. Getting stuff on the street, making sure the conversation you have is, yes, that's good, but what's going to go in this corner? And I think that's really, really important as well. It's a great opportunity for active engagement. Many of you would appreciate that no one goes to the town hall to look at the maps and the plans and the visions of what might happen if council ever gets off its arse to actually do stuff. No one does that. In fact, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a great story of forgetting to go to the town hall to notice that the Earth is about to be removed to make way for a galactic highway. And that's a story that's been told thousands and thousands of times. This is a great way of actively consulting by doing. We've only had 3 or 4 people actually say in certain projects, we don't like this. We've had hundreds of people say, isn't it great that council is finally doing stuff? And we've literally marched in overnight, put this stuff down and said, what do you think of them apples? And we get the consultation, we get the feedback, and we can actually adapt and change. And what this has built is 2 new cultures. There is a new culture happening in the corporation of the City of Adelaide. One that says, let's find solutions. One that says, we know how to solve problems and we're going to put our mind towards creating these solutions to get outcomes on the streets of our city. Instead of hiding behind rule books, instead of hiding behind processes, we've got staff genuinely excited that they're going to make stuff happen, and it's fantastic. But externally, it also builds a really interesting culture. So all of a sudden, people who are moving into their communities or moving around their communities actually get used to change. They get pleasantly surprised. They get challenged. They get to stop and sit. They get to marvel at something that they have never seen in a street that they've walked past every time for the last 20 years. They start to have a different relationship with the streets that they have always taken for granted. And as a result, they get used to change and they're adaptive and they start to understand the city is evolving around them, and they can see it in physical, tangible ways that they've never experienced in their life before. And it actually makes temporary legitimate. One thing I've really found is that at first people said, that looks scruffy, why are we doing that? Why can't we do it properly? And after a while, when you start to see it happen all over the city, people start to think, okay, it's all right to change. The bus lanes are a great example. Introduced as a trial, it has literally, as an issue, disappeared without even as much as a whimper. And it's because we can develop a culture of change in our community where it's okay to give things a go. It's okay for the mayor to get up and say, we got it wrong, we made a mistake, and by God, we're actually proud of that. And all of a sudden, we're getting very little pushback from the media in particular, but also our residents who are actually just cheering us on because we're giving a red hot go. And you start to change not only the culture of the corporation, but how it interacts with the community. And all of a sudden, change becomes that little bit more, or in fact, a lot more acceptable than it ever was before. And what we're actually developing as a result here in Adelaide, and in fact cities all over the world that are doing this, is actually a new urban language. A language that said that we don't change quickly, that things don't change overnight, that you have to wait 10 years to get an outcome, that things have to be perfect before they even ever happen, and that you have to do a whole pile of consultation before you actually get off your ass and actually do stuff in your city. And so this is a conversation that is not only being had in Adelaide, uniquely though I would say Adelaide is arguably leading the country, but is actually happening in cities in Europe, in North America, all over the world. They're saying there is a different way to plan and implement cities and get change happening quicker on the streets of your city. Because it really is about that genuine active intervention. This is about thinking about change on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. Not a year-to-year basis, but finishing things off over time rather than having a short-term and a long-term outcome. It's about adaptive learning. It's great to know that when we screw it up, we can send the guys on a truck that afternoon, they can pick it up, they can move it all around, put it back down and have other people give more feedback. When you get it wrong again, pick it all up, you move it around, you chop and you change, and you have this adaptive process. If it really doesn't work, we stick it on a truck and go and put it somewhere else and get engagement in another part of the city. But ultimately, what this is all about is reinventing a culture of having a flexible city, a city that is dynamic, a city that is growing and evolving day to day, and a community that it starts to expect that change and will engage in a process of evolution in a much more rapid way than they've never done before. So what this whole process is doing is not just about having fun on the streets, it's about changing the way that you think, It's about changing the way that planners think. It's about changing the way that leaders think. And it's about having a city where you can actually dare to dream about what is possible. But in doing so, you can physically get out there that day and experiment and ultimately create change on the streets of your city overnight, in weeks, in months. And in doing that, you accelerate this process of change. And in doing that, you can transform a city. Thanks very much.